For some, it's a miracle drug.
Here's a little something for your troubles.
Thank you.
For others, it's the devil's lettuce.
And ladies and gentlemen, using marijuana as a way to get high, to detach from the surrounding world, it's against the principles of God's word.
But regardless of your stance on this particular drug, you know it by its more common name, marijuana. The criminalization or legalization of marijuana is a topic that is absolutely raging through the millennial zeitgeist at the moment. And I dare to say it's probably one of the most divisive, or at the very least, one of the most controversial issues on ballots today. With several states legalizing marijuana all across the board, and with other states proceeding to legalize at the minimum medicinal marijuana, the issue now becomes apparent. Will marijuana ever be legalized at the federal level? And if so, how do we go about doing that? Hi, my name is Swerve, and I want to welcome you formally to the very first edition of Solve the Problem, my new podcast where we take a look at the controversial topics in modern day politics, and instead of debating the ideologies back and forth, we do what most of us should really be doing, solving the problem. Today we're going to be looking at marijuana, specifically the criminalization or decriminalization of marijuana. And whatever side of the fence you're on, we're going to be looking at how to solve the problem of either keeping it criminalized or decriminalizing it. I hope you'll join me on an adventure today to take a look at the history of marijuana, the reason it's criminalized currently, and the arguments for and against its decriminalization. I want to take a second to remind you, this is not an ideological podcast. We're not interested in discussing whether or not it should be legal or illegal, although we will do some of that in the history perspective. What we're really focusing on today is taking the opportunity to dissect the actual methods of solving the problem of criminalizing or decriminalizing marijuana. So if you're interested in debating the ideologies, this might not be the place for you. But if you're interested in doing what I'd like to do, doing the hard work, getting to the answer, then I think you're going to find yourself right at home. A quick reminder, the content of this podcast could be classified as sensitive due to the fact that we're going to be discussing drug usage, consumption, trade, sale, and, in some aspects, racism, both individual and systematic. For those of you who have younger audience members around, I'd suggest using listener discretion. To those of you who also might find this information sensitive, consider yourself warned. We will be talking about some heavy material. Another quick thing before we get totally topical for the day. At the current moment, I'm suffering from a bit of a sinus infection. So I do apologize if my voice sounds nasally, or if at any time I accidentally produce a sniffle and don't edit it out, or if I seem to be choking over words to prevent a cough. As you all know, this is the time of year where a lot of people get sick. And so I'd just like to take a second to apologize if anything I do is unprofessional, or if anything I say sounds rough or dirty. It's not my intention, it's just what nature dealt me this month. There are those in our society who swear up and down that to go a day without this product would be absolutely insufferable. And not for just recreational purposes or because the person using feels some sort of dependency on marijuana, but because for some of us who are in chronic pain, marijuana is the only option that relieves that pain. I'm sure most of you probably even know someone who will tell you that years of taking pain medication with no result led to nothing but a potential opioid addiction. I'm sure there are also people out there who will tell you that they have a child with epilepsy or some other form of brain disease, to which use of marijuana relieves the symptoms. While we're not 100% sure of the medicinal practices of marijuana, and they haven't been 100% verified, it is an indisputable fact that many people out there who experience different ailments, who use marijuana as an attempt to remedy the situation, see success. Now, as I said, this is not 100% proven, so it doesn't work for everyone, and I'm sure there are many legitimate medical concerns that have not been addressed due to the fact that it is not a conclusive study. That being said, there's a lot more to marijuana than we think, and there's a lot more to marijuana than we may know at the current time. Among those things is whether or not the use of marijuana leads to addiction. Currently, I believe most people who are pro-marijuana will tell you that there is absolutely no addictive principle to the use of marijuana, and that the recreational use of marijuana, so long as the user is a responsible person, is relatively harmless. To which I say this is probably true. In my life experience of dealing with people using marijuana, the worst I could describe their behavior as is annoying. It mellows you out, it makes you incredibly calm, everything seems very funny, and you become extremely hungry. Now, I want to clarify, this is not first-hand experience. I, as a person, have never engaged in the use of marijuana, not for any moral purposes, but because I'm the type of person who likes to live my life 100% in control of my brain. And that is where some of the detractors have an argument with me. You see, whether or not we like to admit it, marijuana is a drug that creates an altered state of mind. Smoking it or consuming it in other fashions does make one high. Now, whether or not there is a dilemma to being high with this particular drug is again up for debate. But enough about the ideologies of marijuana. As I said, today we're going to talk about the solution to either keep it criminalized or decriminalize it. But to do that, we need to understand why it's criminalized in the first place. And despite what many of you may think, it's not necessarily just because of its drug nature. Now today we're not going to talk too much about the hemp aspect of this because I'm saving that information for a different show. One about capitalism, corporate markets, and monopolies for now. Instead, today we're going to focus specifically on some of the historical elements of the actual drug's consumption. And we're going to take a few twists that some of you might not expect. In fact, to give you an example, how would you feel if I told you that one of the primary reasons that marijuana was criminalized in the first place didn't actually have much to do with the consumption of the drug and had more to do with the types of people associated with consuming the drug? Now, if that sounds interesting or unusual or even unlikely to you, my advice would be to strap in, because we're about to go down a political wormhole that some of you may not be ready for.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had. In order to defeat this enemy, which is causing such great concern, and correctly so, to so many American families, money will be provided to the extent that it is necessary and to the extent that it will be useful. Fundamentally, it is essential for the American people to be alerted to this danger, to recognize that it is a danger that will not pass. But I consider this problem so urgent. I also found that it was scattered so much throughout the government, with so much conflict, without coordination, that it had to be brought into the White House And consequently, I brought Dr. Jaffe into the White House, directly reporting to me, so that we have not only the responsibility but the authority to see that we wage this offensive effectively and in a coordinated way.
If you didn't recognize the voice in that clip, it's okay. It just means you're probably pretty young. That was former President Richard Nixon in 1971 addressing what he called in that speech public enemy number one. Of course, public enemy number one in the speech was drugs. Specifically, heroin, marijuana, and other drugs. It's interesting to this day that the language that he chose to address this issue was public enemy number one. For those of you who know the history of Richard Nixon, public enemy number one is not the only enemy he kept. In fact, Richard Nixon was infamous for keeping a list of enemies. Chief among those lists, war protesters, hippies, and members of the African American community. That's right. Richard Nixon had a list of enemies which included entire groups of people. Some of you are probably sitting here listening to this and saying to yourself, well, you know something? I would be on that list then, because I'm an anti-war protester. I'm a hippie. I'm a member of the African American community. It's crazy, isn't it? To think of a time when a president of the United States would have kept a manual list of enemies. And I know there are a lot of you out there saying, you're right, that does sound pretty ridiculous. Why should I believe you? Well, there's good news. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of a member of his cabinet, a Nixon aide. As a matter of fact, why don't I tell you exactly what he said on this particular issue? The quote I'm about to read you comes from a Nixon aide named John Ehrlichman. And again, I want to stress, this is a direct quote. This is not a misattribution. This is not something taken out of context. This is not something that's falsely attributed. This is a direct quote from John Ehrlichman on the matter of using drugs as a tactic of government suppression. So why don't I just read you this quote so you can understand exactly what we're dealing with. Again, I quote John Ehrlichman when I say, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Now, if you're like me, and you know anything about the Nixon administration, this honestly isn't that shocking of a revelation. Considering that Nixon was one of the only presidents to ever be impeached over criminal activity, it doesn't exactly shock me that he was the type of person who would use something like this as a weapon to target groups of people who he was opposed to. However, if you don't know much about the Nixon administration, the quote that I just read to you is probably somewhat shocking. After all, I just described to you in vivid detail from the mouth of an aide of that administration that the use of criminalizing drugs was a weapon, a tool, a tactic designed to disrupt organizers of groups that Nixon found to be enemies. It's interesting. There's a quote that some of you may have heard, maybe not a quote, maybe more of an expression. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. By turning drugs into the enemy, he was able to use that enemy as an enemy of the groups he found to be enemies. So in other words, by using public enemy number one as a tool, he was able to go after the groups he actually thought were his enemies, the people who would get him out of office. The irony is not lost on me that he lost his office due to criminal behavior. But I have to be honest with you guys. This particular moment in time, in 1971, and the rest of the Nixon administration's time, was not the first time that drugs were used as a weapon to stereotype groups in our society, particularly minority groups. There's actually, going all the way back to pre-World War II, evidence that the government criminalized drug use to target immigrants and members of all sorts of minority communities, including African Americans, Mexicans, and even the Chinese. That's right, the Chinese. We'll talk more about all of that in just a second. But I want to play you another clip.
Near Orlando, Florida last night, authorities rushed a 30-year-old shooting victim to the hospital. Today, they're making arrests for his murder. Black leaders are calling such violence America's #1 civil rights problem. But many said the answer is not in the crime bill's call for more police and prisons. Religious and political leaders agreed today to spend more time teaching respect for life and the dignity of others.
Is that going to stop the crime problem next year? The answer is no. But will it, in fact, put us on a course to bring about real and meaningful change on a long-term basis? The answer is yes.
That clip, as you could probably tell by the audio quality, was much more recent. In fact, that clip was NBC Nightly News from 1994. This was during the time that the Clinton administration had sought to revamp the war on drugs, so to speak. The reason I bring this up is because I need to make one point before we proceed. The use of criminalizing drugs to target members of minority groups in the United States is a thing that still continues to this day. As a nation, we imprison more people than any other country on the planet. And we disproportionately do so with higher numbers to members of minority communities. But don't take my word for it. Again, I have a source for you. Although I have a feeling almost all of you will recognize this one.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the U.S. blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis. But there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated $50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest-growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared this so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
That one was rap megastar Jay-Z. And while you're probably sitting here saying to yourself, why would you use Jay-Z as a source? Well, take a look at the information he just provided to you. Rockefeller laws, criminalization, targeting of minority groups. Ask yourself, is it really so outlandish? If you think it is, I'll provide more links for you to check out about Rockefeller laws and the prison system of the United States in the description below this podcast and all platforms that will allow me to do so. We're not going to spend too much time talking about prison, as I'm saving that for an episode on the prison industrial complex and private prisons therein. But I wanted to make this point because it's a strong point when it comes to why marijuana is still criminalized today. One of the facts of the matter is that the criminalization of marijuana is a convenient tool to allow corrupt government agencies, police, offices, higher-ups, whoever it may be. It's a convenient tool to allow them to find an excuse to target, arrest, detain, and process members of minority communities for doing nothing more than existing, speaking out, or exercising their rights granted to them by the United States Constitution. And I'm sorry to you if you do not feel this is true, but unfortunately it is a demonstrable fact, and we experience it every day in the United States. And if you don't believe me, ask a member of the local African American community near you for their story and see if it lines up with what I've just told you today. Odds are, it will. However, to add another bit of fuel to this fire, let me take an opportunity to talk about something way before the Nixon administration. Way before even World War II, going all the way back to the early 1900s in the United States. See, our border to the south, Mexico, had just gone through something known as the Mexican Revolution. And I'm going to tell you now that we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the actual revolution, because other than the fallout, it's not contextually relevant to the conversation. What I would like to point out is that following the Mexican Revolution, America experienced a heavy integration of Mexicans into the United States, seeking to work and live and become citizens. Sound familiar? It's because this is an issue that's going back a long time in history and still continues today, much to the dismay of many people. However, let's stay on topic. A lot of the people who were coming into the United States were headed into states like Texas and Louisiana. And as one would expect, when people from another place come to a new place, they bring with them the things that were common to them, like language and culture and all sorts of things. Amongst the time, one of those things that was prevalent in Mexican culture was the use of cannabis, and for both medicinal and relaxation purposes. Now, they referred to it as marijuana, and again, I'm not a person who's totally up to date with Mexican culture, so if I am mispronouncing that or the Spanish is wrong, please forgive me, and feel free to correct me by messaging me, tweeting me, or emailing me the correct pronunciation, and I will make a shout out on the next episode to that. But again, let's stay on topic. The term marijuana was pretty foreign to Americans. We were all pretty familiar with the phrase cannabis because it existed in medicinal purposes around the country, and let's not forget about how prevalent hemp was all throughout the history of the United States, including all the way back to the founding times and before. So, how did it become a situation where Mexicans bringing marijuana into the country became so vilified? See, it actually had little to do with the marijuana, and it had everything to do with the Mexicans. I know how bad that sounds, but it's the truth. The people at the time wanted to demonize these people for coming in, sort of similarly to how we do now. And so their method was to use the media to do that for them. They were able to play on the fears people had about these immigrants coming in by describing them as deviant, disruptive, and that sort of thing created the image of dangerous behaviors in that culture. And with all of the rapid-fire yellow journalism that was happening at the time, the sensationalist network was able to create a situation where people associated the use of cannabis with reckless and destructive behaviors. Little did the people know that the plant they were talking about and the drug they were describing was something that was used regularly for medicinal purposes throughout the country. It was a perfect example of sensationalist media grabbing something by the tail and destroying it at its very root and ruining it for everyone involved. Sensationalism was the cause of this disruption. The demonization of this plant was an extension of the demonization of a group of people, similar to what Nixon did in the 70s, similar to what the Clinton administration did in the 90s, similar to what we unfortunately still do today. And that's the parallel, ladies and gentlemen. One of the reasons why we've kept it criminalized for so long, as I said before, is because it is an easy tool to use to target members of communities who at the time are the chosen enemy, or as Nixon so elegantly described it, public enemy number one. But the demonization didn't just exist solely through forms of sensationalism in the media. Unfortunately, and somewhat comically, it even extended to the silver screen itself. For a decent period of the 20th century, it was believed by a majority of the public, somewhat comically, that marijuana could create behaviors such as violence, aggression, murder, suicide, and even madness. What did they call this condition?
Marijuana is that drug. A violent narcotic, an unspeakable scourge. The real public enemy number one. Creeping like a communist, it's knocking at our doors, turning all our children into hooligans and whores, voraciously devouring the way things are today, savagely deflowering the good old USA. It's reefer madness, reefer madness.
Reefer madness. Today, we look back at this propaganda film as comical at best. But at the time, this was a real fear amongst the American people, that the consumption of marijuana would lead you to do some terrible things. And if you don't believe me, let's take a look at the actual trailer for the film Reefer Madness. I want to warn you, to our standards, it's pretty silly when you hear it for the first time. But I urge you to resist the temptation to laugh and mock it, and take it in the serious contextual nature that it was originally intended for, so that you can understand the principle behind the production of this film and get a firm grasp on the views of society and the fears of society at that time.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
Now again, to our time, I've failed in my responsibility of not laughing. In our time, that seems utterly ridiculous, especially with all the medical advances we know, all the recreational use that happens on a daily basis that results in no problems whatsoever. But listen to the language they used in that trailer. That was real language for the time. The path to enslavement, soul-destroying reefer, which dibs on that band name. I've got to tell you, at the time, this was a genuine fear. That the consumption of this drug would lead you to enslavement of the mind and the destruction of the soul. Was it a reasonable belief? Obviously not. But it was very much a real belief. And that is because the media sensationalized this activity so deeply that it was considered among one of the worst crimes that you could commit to consume cannabis. Utterly ridiculous, but absolutely what was considered the truth at the time. This propaganda is the direct grandfather of the pervasive mindset that still exists today, that the consumption of marijuana leads to degeneracy. And while there are no direct links, scientific or otherwise, that suggest that consumption of marijuana necessarily leads to degenerate behavior, it is still a very common belief. And unfortunately, it is a belief that exists very prominently among most, or at least many, elected officials today. And I'm glad I said that, because enough of the history lesson. It's time to get to the point. The reason we're all here today is to discuss how to solve the problem. How do we go about keeping it criminalized or decriminalizing it? I'm glad I chose this as my first topic because, fortunately in this situation, the answer is actually very simple. It's going to make some of you uncomfortable, and it's going to make some of you cringe, but the truth is, the most surefire, efficient way to ensure that whatever position you hold on cannabis is taken care of is to vote for candidates who will make the decision you want them to make. Now, again, I understand that you are, well, some of you are probably very skeptical about the idea that voting changes anything. To which I say, if all of you out there who felt that way went out and voted, I guarantee you would change everything. Indeed, if you seek to vote to keep marijuana criminalized, you would most likely be suited to vote conservative. Members of the Conservative Party tend to have a deeply religious background. This is not always true, but it tends to be true. And as the clip from the introduction of the show demonstrated to you, the religious belief commonly amongst the more heartily religious is that marijuana does not line up with religious views. Additionally, members of the Conservative Party and the Republican Party have a very strong history of voting against the legalization of drugs and have a very strong history of voting for harsher sentences and continued criminalization. If that's your bag, that's the direction I'd go in. However, that's not mine. Personally, I believe the consumption of marijuana, either medicinally or recreationally, is perfectly harmless. And so when I vote, I tend to vote for people who I believe will decriminalize marijuana. To give you an example that this is actively happening, I'm going to play you a clip from MSNBC where two senators, one Republican and one Democrat, formally discuss the idea of decriminalizing marijuana together.
Well, this is one of the biggest opportunities to address and advance a federalism policy this country has seen. When it comes to the medical use of marijuana, I've talked to dozens upon dozens of parents whose children are suffering from some form of epilepsy who have been able to receive treatment through medical marijuana, and they've actually seen thousands of seizures a month drop to a dozen of seizures a month. And so this is an advancement that states have decided to take into their own hands. About 46 states right now have some form of marijuana legalization moving forward on the medical side, on the recreational side, CBD, hemp, those kinds of things. This is not a legalization bill, but it is a state's bill that says you can decide for yourselves what you would like to do. You can choose your own destiny. It's what our founders intended, laboratories of democracy.
And the problem we've got right now is that the states can pass their own laws the way Colorado and Massachusetts have, but the federal government hasn't changed its law. So that means that anyone who's using marijuana legally under state law is still at risk under federal law. And then that creates all these crazy fallout pieces. For example, there are federal laws about not being able to put your money into banks if the money comes from illegal activities. Well, so long as the sale of marijuana remains illegal at the federal level, that means that marijuana stores that are perfectly legal in Colorado or in Massachusetts or in any of the other states have to do an all-cash business. It's dangerous and it's dumb. And this bill will fix that. It says if the state says it's legal within the state.
Now again, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I'm not here to tell you how to think. I'm not here to tell you much of anything other than the history and the solution. So I stress again, as cringy as some of you may see it, the honest truth is that the number one surefire way to ensure that your solution to the marijuana problem is taken care of is to vote in people who will vote along with your interests. Thankfully, in this context, it's truly that simple. As we get ready to conclude here, I want to take an opportunity to introduce to you the last segment of the show. Now, considering this is a debut episode, there will be no true last segment today. But in the future, as the show progresses, I'd like to take the opportunity to turn the last segment of the show into a relative Q&A type thing. Essentially what I mean is I want you out there, the audience, to reach out to me through whatever means, Twitter, email, however. And I want you to come to me with information I may have missed, questions on the subjects you may have, and other topics you'd like to discuss. And I will take time at the end of every episode, approximately 5 minutes or more, to give you guys feedback based on what you have said to me. I believe this is a very important thing to do because I believe it is important to engage the community out there, considering that A, the community is not always going to agree with my solutions, and B, sometimes the community might not be ready to embrace a solution, and it's my job to reach out to them to try to convince them that the time is now. So, with that being said, again, a debut episode won't have a true final segment, but I'm hoping I can encourage you guys to get out there, work on finding information that you think is relevant, and sending it my way. As an aside, one of the reasons I enjoy this kind of topic is because having you go out and doing the work yourself means that you'll be out there doing research on your own, coming to your own conclusions, and essentially fact-checking me, making sure that I'm right, making sure that I'm up to date, and making sure that the things I'm saying are accurate. In the process, you will learn all sorts of new things that you may not know now, and those new things may enter your head and change your opinion and reflect upon the things that you already believe, maybe insofar as challenging your cognitive dissonance. And isn't that what we're really doing here today, guys? Other than solving the problem, we're challenging common held beliefs. We're looking for solutions, and the best way to do that is to do the work. I believe I've done a significant bit of work for this episode, and I believe I may even put out an addendum because there's a lot I didn't get to in order to keep this episode somewhat short. So keep looking out for maybe more information on this topic in the future. 15 or 100 episodes down the line, I may put up a follow-up to this to suggest here's some more information that's come out. Or if the laws change, maybe I'll do a reflection. You never know exactly. So again, feel free to reach out to me through whatever means necessary, and feel free to come to me with information so that we together can solve the problem. Thanks for listening to today's episode about the decriminalization of marijuana. While it may be a bit of a tease to suggest such a complicated issue and give such a simple solution, sometimes Occam's razor is absolutely the case, in that the simplest answer is usually the correct one. And in this case, the simplest answer of voting in candidates who will vote the way that you feel is the truthful answer. Yes, there's a lot to be done with the criminal justice system. Yes, there's a lot to be done with the corporate capitalist system, and I agree with all of those. But those are separate issues that I'd like to tackle at another time. For now, let's focus on the drug itself and remind ourselves that we can make the changes or keep the consistencies as we see fit, but we have to be willing to do our part to make it happen. We, as people and as voters, have to be willing to get out there and solve the problem. If you enjoyed today's episode of Solve the Problem with Swerve, you can support the podcast a number of ways. Make sure you follow and subscribe on whatever platform you prefer to listen to podcasts on. If you're able to, leave a 5-star review. If not, whatever you can leave is perfectly fine. You can also follow me on Twitter at Swerve City Elite and follow our parent company, Elite City Media, for all of the updates on future podcasts and other projects. Solve the Problem with Swerve is an Elite City Media production.